After nearly 10 years, the U.S. prepares its exit strategy to scale down troops in Afghanistan. But are Afghan security forces ready to take control of their country? And what happens when U.S. forces pull out? This is Inside Story. Good to have you with us on Inside Story. I'm Dareen Abughaida. When the U.S. president unveiled his exit strategy from Afghanistan in December 2009, he also announced the deployment of an additional 30,000 troops to the country. Barack Obama did so with the promise that the U.S. troops will begin a phased withdrawal from Afghanistan by the summer of 2011. And according to Obama, the ultimate goal is to hand over control to Afghan forces by 2014. Rosalind Jordan assesses some of the challenges ahead.
There are nearly 100,000 U.S. troops in Afghanistan. It's the longest conflict in U.S. military history. The strategy: crush the enemy, teach the Afghan forces how to do it themselves, and build civil society. When President Barack Obama announced the increase in forces in 2009, Helmand Province was one of the most violent. But now it's much safer. So much so, the U.S. general in charge of the area says the capital of the province will be one of the first cities to return to Afghan control as the surge ends.
We're going to deepen the hold that we currently have in the central Helmand River Valley. There's been tremendous success down there.
Another success, observers say, Kabul, where it was especially important to succeed to prove the capital could be secure. But along the eastern border with Pakistan, the situation remains unstable, and U.S. troops could be redeployed to those areas.
The conditions on the ground don't necessarily lend itself to a substantive withdrawal of troops. Furthermore, there's a lot that's left to be done in different parts of the country where the surge forces did not go.
But U.S. troops are needed not just to clamp down on fighting. They're also needed to continue to train Afghan security forces.
The argument against pulling out substantial troops at this point is that in most areas of the country, the Afghan National Security Forces are simply not capable yet of taking on that burden all by themselves.
Even though they may not be ready yet, the American public is certainly ready for the war to end. If all goes to Obama's plan, Afghan forces should take over by the end of 2014. That's when the president has promised to bring U.S. forces home. Rosalind Jordan, Al Jazeera.
Let's bring in our guests to discuss this. We have in Kabul Daoud Sultanzoy, who's a former member of the Afghan parliament. And also joining us from Washington is Brian Katulis. He's a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, and his work, in fact, focuses on U.S. national security policy in the Middle East and South Asia. Gentlemen, very happy to have you both on this edition of Inside Story with us. But before we start our discussion, I'd just like you to hear what the U.S. Secretary of Defense recently said, because in the U.S. itself, it seems there's been debate in the White House, Pentagon, as well as the State Department, whether to start with a significant drawdown of U.S. troops or just a minor one. Now, the Afghan Security Force stands at 280,000, and it's expected to meet the NATO target of 300,000 by year end. But the Pentagon argues that at least 400,000 Afghan security forces are required to secure the country. Let's just listen to what Gates had to say.
We will continue to train, equip, and support Afghan security forces and do what we can to help the government improve the lives of its citizens. In short, there will be no rush to the exits.
No rush to the exit. That's what Robert Gates is saying. Daoud, if I can come over to you first in Kabul, whether we see a significant drawback of U.S. troops or a smaller one this year, in your opinion, sitting there in Kabul, are Afghan security forces ready to take control of their country?
I think it's not just the Afghan security forces' readiness. There are non-military issues that are derailing or at least sabotaging even the meager readiness of our security capabilities. For example, emotional politicking, the domestic politics of the United States, the pre-election, and also the regional factors that are not under U.S. or Afghan control in Iran and Pakistan and other countries that are using Iran and Pakistan as their proxies. And also non-military issues that are threatening security within the country, like governance, like corruption, like rule of law. So it's not just the military readiness that will derail, unreadiness that will derail the premature withdrawal. There are other things.
You're absolutely right, and we're going to talk about all these other things. Brian, over to you in Washington. Daoud was just laying out there issues such as governance. He was talking about corruption. He was talking about the lack of rule of law. Doesn't sound like a successful recipe for a country to run itself at this point.
No, it certainly isn't, and I'm glad Daoud raised those issues because I think there's an unhelpful focus on simply how many U.S. troops are in the country of Afghanistan, and we need to broaden our debate to include those issues. Because if Afghanistan institutions are going to sustain themselves, we've got to answer deep questions like if we're building a security force that numbers in the hundreds of thousands, as you indicated, how is that going to sustain itself in the long run, given the economic difficulties in the country, given the corruption problems, and given the institutional weaknesses? So I think a big part of the debate should be how do we help Afghans construct a new political system and an economic system that can sustain itself. But unfortunately, our media debate here in Washington, in the United States, often focuses on just the narrow measure of how many U.S. boots are on the ground, and I think that's really unfortunate.
All right, well, what I want us to do, the three of us, is take this discussion away from this numbers game that, Brian, you were just referring to. Daoud, tell me a little bit about what your biggest concerns are on the ground in Afghanistan about the troops' withdrawal this year and also the complete withdrawal by the year 2014.
I think the initial drawdown sends a very unstabilizing signal that these withdrawals are probably going to create a situation where the enemy would be boldened, and also in the absence of non-military achievements, this will create a much bigger void in which they can navigate and operate. And also, when we talk about 2014, it's not just the 280,000 security forces. That's very misleading because it's including the police and the secret police and all that. But in Afghanistan, the military sometimes does police work, and the police does the military work. And the lack of coordination, lack of cooperation by the regional countries, these are all very, very daunting threats. And the region has not come to grips to make sure that Afghanistan should be stabilized. Even farther countries in the region are happy to see the United States leave, happy to see the West leave, so they can see a weak Afghanistan in which they can see their strategic depths, in which they can see their future raw material resources. And all of those things are not going to create a situation where they would like a stable, strong Afghan government or Afghan state.
Daoud, as we're saying, it's been nearly 10 years since the U.S. went into this war in Afghanistan. And in fact, I just want to tell you about a UN survey that found that Afghan people have little confidence in their local police, and fewer than a third saw the police as well-trained and prepared to take over duties from international forces. 10 years on, what have the U.S. troops and the international presence then done for Afghanistan?
There are several things that have been achieved. We cannot totally discard those achievements. And in non-military fields like the schools, education, health, media, and communication, although some of them are not sustainable, some of them may be very superficial and may lack quality, but still it is a path that is in the right direction. But we are not in a sustainable path. It's not a straight line, and that is something that is going to create a situation where the Afghan people are not as satisfied as they want to be, or their expectations are not met because they were high. On the other hand, even a meager expectation that were not met, the lack of satisfaction is always projected towards the United States because of our government's policies and statements and emotional politicking.
Brian, Daoud there bringing up, I think, something crucial, and that's the word of sustainability. That's the key in Afghanistan. Do you think that the Afghanis are seeing much sustainability, whether it's in projects or security?
No, I'm afraid not. And what the Afghan economy we have right now is a war-driven Afghan economy. My big concern is that when U.S. troops and other international troops start to depart, that you may have a very major recession or depression appearing in Afghanistan, because much of the economy is built upon the networks of spending of development assistance and military assistance, and we need to pay more attention to that. One other thing I want to highlight, I think there's a bit of a nonsense debate that is happening about the U.S. troop withdrawal, and I think there's, even in this discussion, some errors that are made. The U.S. doesn't plan to leave anytime soon, and even the 2014 date that everybody highlights doesn't mean that U.S. troops are actually going to be gone by 2014. All of these things are actually in discussion with the Afghan authorities, and they're trying to develop a long-term strategic partnership agreement, a strategic framework agreement. So this notion, which I think is facile and simplistic, that somehow the U.S. troops are just pulling up stakes and leaving in Afghanistan and abandoning it to all of these bad forces that are present in the country and in the region, is just simply false. What we're seeing here is the start of a transition. President Obama tonight will announce this start of a transition, and I think the fundamental task is actually to help define what does the transition mean. And part of that is addressing these questions of sustainability that you just asked about. How do we get the Afghan political and economic system to stand on its own? And quite frankly, we've not discussed that enough since 2009, since President Obama entered office.
What, in your opinion, then, Brian, is going to happen after 2014?
Well, it all depends on what sort of leadership we see from not only Hamid Karzai, the president of Afghanistan, but all of the Afghan leaders, both within the security agencies and in the political institutions. It also depends on whether there are serious steps forward in terms of reconciliation and reintegration of those elements that are not part of the Afghan political system. So there are a lot of moving parts here. We often, again, focus on the simplistic security metrics, which is important. You need to have basic security. You need to have a police and an army that can help defend the citizens from attacks. But if we don't have answers to those bigger questions, so I think between now and 2014, that's the fundamental test. Again, I think President Obama will talk about this period as being a period of transition to 2014. And what we see after 2014 largely depends on whether Afghan leaders are going to make the decision to serve their people rather than to serve their own self-interests, whether Afghan leaders are going to actually get the money to affect their people's lives as opposed to line their own pockets in corrupt practices that we've seen for the last 10 years. And I think that's the real fundamental issue.
Daoud, what is the likelihood of that, what Brian is saying, that Afghan officials will look to do the best for their own people, taking into account what you've seen sitting there in Kabul, being a former member of parliament?
Brian is depicting a very elaborate picture saying political institutions. In 10 years that went by, nobody, including the Afghan government, paid attention to create political institutions that will play a role in stability in Afghanistan or play a role in reducing corruption and enhance the rule of law. The people of Afghanistan and those fledgling figures that are trying to become political figures or create political institutions are hostages to warlords that are sponsored by the West, that are were resurrected by the West, and we are at their mercy. So how can we talk about political institutions that we haven't paid attention to in 10 years?
Brian?
I think every leader that represents a constituency needs to defend that constituency in its right way, in its own way. And you and I share the same sort of criticisms, Daoud, about the lack of focus and attention from political institutions. My fundamental view, and having worked in dozens of countries now, is that the power and legitimacy should come from the inside. The U.S. can't export that. We cannot gerrymander things, and we can't actually fix these problems that the Afghan leaders need to do themselves. We can actually try to motivate leaders to do that and create incentives. We've not done a very good job at doing that. But at this stage, I think we need to expect more from not only Hamid Karzai, but from the people in Parliament to offer a check and balance on Karzai's power.
Daoud, go ahead. Feel free.
I have a different opinion. Yeah.
Let's hear it.
I have a different opinion here. We are not expecting the United States to babysit us or teach us how to walk. we want them at least not to tilt the playing field in the favor of warlords by not doing anything. By, you know, they get all the contracts, they are in charge of the economy, they are in charge of security, they have guns, they have rockets and bombs. And I understand, Brian, that you want us to be courageous and defend our turf, but defending a turf with a pen against rockets is not a very easy thing in the field here. It may seem easy from Washington.
All right.
Yeah. No, I agree with you, Daoud. I agree with you there, and I think there are a lot of faults in how we've actually implemented things like counterinsurgency strategy, how our military spends money. We sometimes know not what we do in terms of who we're supporting. And we need a full-blown assessment of what we're doing there, because I think the main thing that you and I agree on is that the Afghans need to own their country, and that for results to be sustainable both politically and economically, we need to change the way that we do business. And I think that can be done in this period of transition.
All right, and Brian, just speaking of money for a second, let's just pause here, because I'd like to look at the cost of the war, in fact, in Afghanistan. And this is according to the United Nations. But the United States government has reportedly spent $444 billion to date on Afghanistan. And in fact, it's not only the monetary cost, it's the human cost as well. And more than 2,500 coalition troops have been killed. And among those, 1,600 were U.S. soldiers, in fact. But the number of Afghan casualties is much higher. And the UN says that nearly 10,000 Afghans have died since 2006. Other estimates say that the actual number could be much higher. Daoud, I'm just curious to ask you, because you're sitting there in Kabul and you're perhaps able to gauge how the people feel on the streets of Kabul, whether it's a withdrawal this year, whether it's a withdrawal in 2014. What do people in Afghanistan want to see happen at this point?
First of all, the people here feel that they're bystanders. Everybody talks over their head, and they make decisions for them. They write recipes and prescriptions before they check the patient or ask them what they want. So they're frustrated, they're almost resigned, and they're numb because they see these armored vehicles by warlords, armored vehicles by troops. They go by concrete blocks all over, the city is blocked, the government doesn't pay attention to their needs, the international community is sometimes not coordinating with the Afghan government, they sometimes talk at each other instead of to each other. So the people notice that, and they think that this is something else. This picnic is going on for other people that Afghans are not invited to, and they're frustrated.
Okay, that's the view of the people in Kabul. Brian, over to the United States, because this has reportedly become a very unpopular war with people, with Americans, in fact, where you're sitting. And as I was just saying, we were showing there that the UN estimates that this has cost the U.S. $440 billion. So it's understandable, in a way, why the U.S. would want to get out and why Americans, in fact, would want their government to get out of there.
Yeah, and you look at the performance thus far, and we've had many people sacrifice their lives and serve our country over in Afghanistan. But when you look at the results that have been achieved on the ground in Afghanistan, it's really shameful when I travel to Afghanistan and see what little has been done for the Afghan people. Now, we'll have media campaigns here in the U.S. From the U.S. government and others who will try to say, well, we've made lives better. But if you look at counterinsurgency, which is one of the buzzwords that is used to describe some aspects of the U.S. policy, we're supposedly doing counterinsurgency in parts of Afghanistan. Yet over the last 2 years, these 2 years have been the deadliest years for Afghan civilians. The number one metric, the measure for a counterinsurgency campaign, is whether we're keeping the population safe. And clearly, we're not doing it. And I think for all of the problems that Daoud has highlighted, with the way that we do business, with who we're actually working with, I think that's a big part of the challenge. And I think most Americans, the last thing I would say, is that we'd like to take this sad song and make it better. We'd like to use this opportunity for transition to achieve some positive results for the Afghan citizens.
What ultimately,
there is this challenge of our own economic...
Brian, what's the U.S. Ultimate political strategy in Afghanistan, in your opinion?
Well, they don't have a coherent one at this stage because right now we have, as I said, our debate, but also I think the policy discussion in the government is largely focused on the military and security aspects of it, and that's important. We've got a team at the State Department led by Ambassador Mark Grossman, who I think is doing a great job in trying to figure out what is the way forward on helping Afghans construct a political roadmap ahead, linking these notions of reconciliation, reintegration, with notions of political reform of the Afghan system. And I think they're going to try to do their best there, but this is the space where I say, you know, Afghans need to take a greater lead in that because we can't do it for them. But we do, as Daoud was indicating, need to reassess who we're actually partnering with, who our military is partnering with, particularly these warlords. And when we talk about reconciliation, I think it's a nice, fine word, but it actually, I think, obscures the fact that when we're talking about reconciliation, it is peace deals between drug warlords in some aspect. And that, I think, is a very difficult thing for many Afghan civilians to swallow. But the last thing I'd say is that I think the American public clearly has lost its patience and the cost that we're spending, you know, $120 billion for U.S. taxpayers alone. But I think there's some room and space, political space, for President Obama to turn this around. But it's going to require a debate that includes the things that Daoud and I are talking about. How do we actually help Afghans reform their political and economic systems? And how do we do business in a different way that does not empower warlords and others that have bad intentions for their own society?
Daoud, there's an argument that says that if you look at this from the point of view of the Taliban, flagging up this exit strategy that we're talking about with troop withdrawal dates and numbers and all of that kind of thing, doesn't this just encourage the Taliban to sort of wait out the foreign troops and then get back in there? Is that not a worry for you?
Yes, before I say anything about that, I heard the 120 billion figure, which is a very big, huge number, but it's very misleading because American people or international community might hear this and say, oh, this money is spent on Afghans in Afghanistan. In fact, a fraction of that is spent for Afghan projects that are not even tangible for the people. Most of it is spent in fuel and forks and knives and apples and bananas and other things that the troops are using. The cost of the troop upkeep in Afghanistan is probably a huge chunk of it. It's a few billion of that is spent in very ineffective way in the non-military aspects in Afghanistan, which is meager. To come to your question, I said earlier also that the premature, or the way, as Brian also mentioned it, the way we are talking about this drawdown and withdrawal, the numbers are not that important, but the psychological effect of this has created a situation where, in the presence of non-military performance by the Afghan government and the international community, and corruption and lack of rule of law, the dissatisfaction of the people has created a void in which the Taliban are going to roam into and really enjoy if we're not careful.
Okay, and we're just coming to the end of the program here, but Daoud, as you said before, you answered one of my questions, and you said that, in fact, a lot of gains have been made in Afghanistan. So just ending this on a positive note, are they sustainable?
No, I think the gains, first of all, I agree with Brian that the United States will not pull out, but just the psychological effect of a very drastic drawdown or the depression that is foreseen after a precipitous withdrawal, I think will derail the meager achievements and also the very, very unsustainable path that is there that we could have built on. We have not paid attention to some of the non-military aspects of capabilities that will create a sustainable path towards reconstruction and path towards good governance and rule of law. Those things are lagging, even the meager achievements of our military side. So we should be paying attention to those sides if we want to create a sustainable path. And 2 or 3 years may not be enough for those achievements.
All right. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. Brian Katulis out of Washington and Daoud Sultanzoy. And of course, to our viewers, we thank you for joining us here on Inside Story. And of course, we welcome your comments and your suggestions. As always, you can email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. From me and the team, goodbye for now.